take care. Do it. Okay. Okay, see you soon. See you soon. Are you ready?
I'm just going to go with loudspeaker.
You can put it up on your phone. That helps.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Hi all, so we will be beginning shortly. We only have 6 presentations in the session as opposed to 7, so we'll give maybe folks 2 or 3 more minutes to settle in and then start.
Thank you, Saad.
Hi again, so I think we're going to start now. How is everyone doing? So I'm Saad Hassan. I'm an assistant professor at Tulane University, and I'll be your session chair. I work on reading accessibility, so I'm very excited to listen to all the presentation. We have a range of presentations from DIY tools, writing tools, to typography, all within the context of reading and writing accessibility. So I'm very excited. We have 6 presentations, 6 speakers. So let's make it engaging. Let's give a round of applauses, and let's ask good questions. So with that, I would like to introduce the first speaker. So our first speaker is going to be Monalika, and they will be presenting a paper on study of blind users' experiences with DIY manuals. Yeah. Let's give them a round of applause.
Yay!
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Monalika from Stony Brook University. Thank you so much for being here. And today, I'm presenting my research work titled Lost in Instructions. So it is essentially a study of blind users' experiences with DIY manuals and their AI-generated rewrites, specifically for instruction-mediated DIY tasks like assembly, operation, troubleshooting of tangible products. Now, let's begin with an example. Imagine you're assembling a chair or setting maybe a timer on a new air fryer you just bought. So what happens? First step, you usually look at the manufacturer-provided manual. Now, it basically says something like, attach part A into part B, supported by a bunch of exploded view diagrams. Now, for sighted users, these instructions are quite actionable. They can inspect the layout, maybe map the labels to components, and visually verify each step. However, for blind users, the same instruction model breaks down. Here, the challenge is not simply about accessing the text. It's basically about interpreting the diagrams and their accompanying references, and basically to infer how the parts relate or what actions to perform, and so on. Thus, blind users increasingly rely on visual assistive tools, things like KNFB readers, seeing AI, or even sometimes general purpose AI tools like ChatGPT, to basically not just read the manuals in terms of the text, but actually to obtain some kind of an operationalizable guidance. Now, prior work has already studied the AI support for blind users across many domains, such as navigation, shopping, cooking, scene understanding, and document access. But many of these tasks are comparatively more flexible and forgiving. For instance, in cooking, the users can often reorder the steps. See, for example, in this example, while preparing, you can basically prepare the batter before the ganache or substitute the tools, right? For example, use a frying pan instead of the skillet, and so on. However, product-related DIY tasks are different. The parts are rarely interchangeable, the orientation and alignment are quite critical, and the errors may remain latent until several steps later, after which the point of recovery becomes substantially more costly. As a result, the ambiguity is harder to absorb. So the challenge here is merely not to restate the step, but to re-express it in a form that supports independent and non-visual task execution. So this raises an important question. Can the current AI tools reliably transform such vision-centric manuals into clear, non-visual instructions that a blind user can follow from start to finish? To investigate this further, we conducted a semi-structured interview with 15 blind participants using the recent critical incident approach. Here, the participants reflected on their various product-related DIY experiences from maybe about prior 2 months involving assembly, learning to use a new product, or troubleshooting. So guided by our research questions, we basically examined how the blind users used manuals, how the AI flows fit into these workflows, where the breakdowns occurred, and what kind of instruction support they essentially wanted. So we analyzed the data using the hybrid reflexive thematic analysis. Now, moving on to the findings, the interview studies basically highlighted that manuals remain the most official and the most trusted source of information. However, the reliance varied by the task. For assembly and setup, the manuals were quite central. This is because the tasks were highly sequence dependent and mistakes often led to safety or failures. So in these situations, the blind users were comfortable spending even more amount of time just to get things right in the first place. For learning to use a product for the first time, the manuals were often used more selectively, specifically when the trial and error failed. However, for troubleshooting, the manuals were least used. This is basically because the participants often felt that the sections were too generic, they often did not contain the required information, or basically they lost the manuals, or sometimes just looking for that kind of information was not worthy of it. Next, moving on to the challenges, we uncovered 4 stage breakdowns in AI-mediated translation of these said instruction manuals. First, the AI tools often preserve the manual's visual reference, such as missing part labels, image references, and color references. Instead of translating them into non-visual, task-relevant cues, something like tactile cues. So the output, though it was technically accessible, was still not operationalizable. Second, the participants, even when they could identify the relevant components, the AI output often failed to support spatial actions. The instructions often lacked stable guidance for orientation, alignment, relative positioning, often leaving the users with insufficient information to assemble or to manipulate them correctly. Third, instead of decomposing the multi-action steps into simple, smaller, manageable units, they frequently often reproduce the same step density as the manual. This often increased the cognitive load and made it difficult for them to track or recover from the missing sub-actions. Consequently, the blind users often attempted to cope by externalizing the instructions through braille notes, or basically asking the sighted helpers to dictate the steps. And however, even these strategies frequently broke down because they would just read the same things out and there was no way they could make sense of that. Fourth, the follow-up clarification that they asked the AI tools was often unreliable. The responses were often vague and lacked sufficient cues for non-visual verification, or they introduced hallucinations, which is a well-known AI problem, or they often had inadequate cues. Together, these failures meant that the current AI systems could often expose the content of the manuals, but failed in translating them into executable, operationalizable, step-by-step guidance. Because the AI support often failed, blind users often turned to workarounds such as YouTube videos or sighted assistants. However, even those alternatives were not sufficient. As we all know, sometimes the videos often assume the visual view, relying on a bunch of gestures, pointing, on-screen text, or basically a video with no sound or anything that basically just shows the operation without verbalizing the information. And even sighted help, for that matter, was a little inconsistent. This is because the usefulness of the guidance from a sighted helper often depended on the helper's ability to describe the task non-visually and with enough specificity to support independent task action. So the participants often had to become a bridge, stitching together fragmented and sometimes even conflicting guidance across manuals, AI tools, videos, helpers, all the while tracking where they were in the task and deciding what to trust. This often made the DIY task cognitively exhausting and often stretched them to 2 to 3 times more than the duration of their sighted peers. So what the blind users wanted was a better structure. They wanted a tactile overview of they wanted a product overview with tactile cues. They wanted atomic actions with directions and confirmation cues, a prelude orientation step that basically gives a high-level idea of the device's state before, during, and after the completion, and some kind of an actionable recovery in case they are not able to do the task correctly. Now, the interview study, of course, revealed the broad challenges that blind participants faced. Now, to examine how these challenges manifested in real time, we conducted an interview study, a user study with 7 blind participants. So these participants basically performed the DIY tasks essentially in the same setting that they normally would do. The study essentially exposed the behavioral patterns and procedural details to how these failures unfolded during the task execution. Here, in this task, there was no participant overlap between the 2 participants. We used a concurrent think-around protocol along with in-situ probing, and the experiments intervened only when they were explicitly requested, consistent with the participant preferences that were identified in the interview study regarding how the instructional support should be structured and delivered. The participants completed the 4 representative DIY tasks, 2 for assembly. For assembly, we used desk organizer and a ring light, and for learning to operate and troubleshoot, we used a lamp timer and an alarm clock. They were allowed to use their preferred screen readers, their preferred AI tools, while external aids such as video tutorials, volunteered assistants like placing calls on Be My Eyes were blocked so that we could isolate what the manuals and the AI systems can support realistically. We used metrics such as task completion rate, task completion time, task accuracy, and human intervention counts. Here, on deeper probing into the user study, we observed a clear pattern in prompting behavior across the participants with varying level of AI experience. Here, the beginners often tended to rely more on long narrative prompts with vague references, whereas the intermediate and advanced users formulated a quite structured and step-specific explicit queries. However, the improvement in the prompting also did not resolve the underlying limitation. Even with the advanced kind of prompting, they often encountered failures when AI was unable to translate the manuals into grounded, non-visual actionable cues. Here, no participant completed the tasks independently, and the overall task completion rate stayed below 50%, and nearly all participants exceeded the allotted time. Here, what was especially striking was that roughly half the time spent on the task was mainly with the AI failures rather than actually performing the task. So the dominant cause was not just physical manipulation, it was basically the effort that was required to interpret, recover, or repair from the inadequate instructional support. So this corroborated from our interview study finding that current AI tools make manual accessible at the text level, but reliable execution, but do not reliably provide instructions at the action level. Human intervention counts over here were a strong indicator of effective support. When participants explicitly asked for help, the experimenters restructured the guidance using the same support identified in the interview study. Here, we observed that the repeated clarification request was reduced to almost 80% compared to the AI prompts alone, highlighting that the structured non-visual guidance basically supports independent task completion and less kind of human interventions, and thus supports independence. The user study also surfaced additional failure modes that the interview study could not fully expose. We observed a counterintuitive pattern here. The participants, when they upload the product manual photos, instead of improving the guidance, the images kind of made it worse. The tools often shifted to their more generic vision description manner and produced responses that were quite disconnected from the participants' current step. Hallucinations, which is a well-known limitation of LLM. In this context in DIY task, we found that some type of hallucinations were more consequential when in task completion. So here, among these, the factual hallucination, content hallucination, and semantic hallucinations were most consequential for task completion because they increased the time, wasted effort, and repeated the exploration, and increased the need for human intervention. In conclusion, our findings show that accessible manuals are not enough for blind users to complete the DIY tasks independently. What is needed is grounded, stepwise executable actions without vision. Across both the studies, we found that current AI tools often fell short on this goal, but the structured support identified by the participants also point to how the future systems can do better. So, thank you.
Thanks, Monalika, for the presentation. So we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Anyone in the room? And you can come. So I have a couple of questions. So I think first question that I had was that, did you see a difference in sort of like expectations from participants when they were looking for support in the moment while they're doing that an activity, as opposed to like if they were looking at it before? Or yeah. Were there any differences in preferences?
Interestingly enough, we did not find any such differences between the participants. Their preferences remained consistent across the interview study and the user study. So this kind of gives us like a kind of a bridge or a high-level understanding as to how we could structure the AI instructions for supporting better instructions.
Gotcha. Any questions from the crowd again? So I'll ask maybe one more question. So so I mentioned that some of the participants liked detailed instructions, but others, so there might have been variability in sort of like how they would like the output to be structured. Did anyone mention using any reading support tools on top of this? So for example, like text simplification or restructuring? So did they ask for any of that, or did that come up?
They did not.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's give our speaker another round of applause. Okay, so next up we have Emily Wang, who will be presenting a paper, and they'll be presenting a paper on co-designing writing tools with a dyslexic academic.
Please hold. Let's see. All right. Okay, we see friendly faces in the room. We see a thumbs up from Saad. We see a lovely interpreter helping us out. Thank you. And slides are on the screen. I think we're ready to go. All right, starting my timer now. So hello, CHI 2026 in Barcelona. I'm Emily Wang. I'm faculty in computer science at Oberlin College, and our paper is titled Infrastructuring for Access, Co-Designing Writing Tools with a Dyslexic Academic. And the dyslexic academic in the title is my co-author, Aron Marie. He's not only my co-author, he's also my design partner and faculty in anthropology and sign language at the University of Virginia. All right, we'll speed run through the presentation. So I'll start with a vignette and related work. Then I'll summarize our case study, which includes a system and qualitative field deployment. I'll conclude with our conceptual contribution. Please see the paper for more on the empirical and technical details. And then for presentation access, I'm going to weave image descriptions into explanations as I go. All right, let's set the scene. So, my co-author Aron is an academic who writes for linguistic anthropology. His research is about sign language interpreting in Hanoi, Vietnam. Like many sub-areas, it's full of jargon. There's a lot of reading, there's a lot of writing. Here's an example of something he's typed in docs. The sentence is, we can think of sign language interpreting as a process of re-intextualization, where the interpreter is producing a new utterance which is supposed to interdiscursively point back to the original. So in this screenshot, we see red squiggles appear under interdiscursively, meaning that it's flagged as potentially misspelled. But here's the thing. Aron's dyslexic, which means that he knows that he's an unreliable speller, and also spell check is not reliable for all of our academic jargon. right? Which means that he needs to do something else to triangulate what's ultimately going to be the correct spelling for his paper. So to do that triangulation, he's going to reappropriate search engines. What this means is he opens a new browser tab, copy-pastes the text in question into Google, looks in the search result page, highlights what he needs, copy-pastes if he needs to, and then goes back to the document. So this vignette is just for one sentence. It's not surprising to have to look up words every once in a while, but if you're a dyslexic academic like Aron, you have to do this for most of the sentences you type on your Word documents for days, right? And that becomes very labor-intensive, and in itself is a form of access labor for him to keep participating as an anthropologist. So how might we approach this as accessibility researchers? I'll show you 3 different lenses that we considered and comment on the power dynamics, design space, and impact on disabled communities' lived experience. So the first lens is to remove barriers, right? This involves big tech acknowledging they have a diverse user base for their writing tools and trying to improve the spell check implementation with more data, particularly from dyslexic writers. But this still doesn't resolve Aron's problem with double-checking the spell check. In that experience, he still has to triangulate if and when spell check is correct or if he's correct, and it's still labor-intensive. The second lens is to celebrate disabled creativity. So critical disability studies and cryptechnoscience recognize disabled people as designers and hackers of everyday life. We can then recognize how disabled people reappropriate existing tools for workarounds and co-create access. But that still doesn't resolve the access labor issues, and it's going to get worse over time as Aron continues in his career as an anthropologist. So we wanted to take this critical perspective, but still extend it more concretely into the design process. Where we eventually landed was to support infrastructuring. Infrastructuring theory comes from CSCW, and we realize that its concepts can help us a lot with understanding and supporting access labor. As a theory, it considers both of the power dynamics we just mentioned, right? Big tech is going to deploy the globally available tools like Docs and Microsoft Word, and practitioners will adapt in the local use context. We can then interpret the workarounds, like Aron going to triangulate with search engines, as desire paths. You might be familiar with desire paths from architecture or from everyday life. They're the unofficial paths that people take when the official paved ones are more annoying or less efficient. And so we'll use this as a design metaphor throughout the talk. And the desired impact here is that tools can evolve alongside practitioners and improve over time. So it goes beyond just initial customization presets at the beginning. All right, I'm going to try and show you how we put that into practice, supporting infrastructuring for our system and deployment. So the key idea here is that the workarounds that disabled practitioners are already doing is in itself design knowledge, right? We have a case study where Aron's the anthropologist, I'm the designer engineer working with him, and he is writing his dissertation. So I'll map more of the infrastructuring factors to our case study. The next slide. So infrastructuring really looks at the interplay between the globally available tools and the local use context. So in our case of writing tools, globally available tools include word processors, spell check, and the standardized English dictionary. The local use context also includes Aron's access needs, the research literature he's citing, his ethnographic data set, which is fieldwork in Vietnam, and his dissertation committee as the audience for his writing. Infrastructuring also acknowledges from the start that globally available tools might not work immediately for the local use context. And so points of infrastructuring refer to the breakdowns, right, what requires you to do more of that adaptation, and the active infrastructuring is the workarounds that you're doing to make it work. So in Aron's case, points of infrastructuring are when spell check frequently breaks down, and the infrastructuring is when he's going to use search engines or other strategies to do that access labor. So putting on my engineering hat, what could we do to make this workaround more robust? And so to visualize this idea, the image on the right shows how a university paved the desire paths that were initially left by students' foot traffic onto their campus quad, showing how what people were doing and experiencing on the ground then informed what the design became to be. And so in an analogous way, how might this search and copy-paste workaround become features of the writing tools? And so with that perspective, I built the Jargon Manager toolkit. And Jargon Manager is a riff off of citation managers like Zotero or Mendeley. So within the Jargon Manager toolkit, there's a browser extension and a docs add-on. In the browser extension, writers can highlight and collect jargon on web pages. So this is how we get the copy-paste. It circumvents spelling because he's just highlighting what's already there. And so in the browser extension, there's also a drop-down form where you can put in more notes and metadata to help distinguish the words. The browser extension then saves this all to a Google Sheet, which can then be used by the rest of the toolkit in the future. And so within the docs add-on is a sidebar interface and a custom autocomplete. And so this is how we get that search aspect without having to leave the word processor. As the user types in letters, the results below update with substring matches to what has been saved previously in the dictionary. Aron didn't need an algorithm to predict what he was going to write. He just needed something that could expedite that lookup. So to evaluate Jargon Manager, we had to go back to the local use context to see if this had an impact on the infrastructure he was already doing. So we prioritized ecological validity in a field deployment that included 8 months of him writing his dissertation. And so I'm going to share 2 examples from the deployment that follow up on the infrastructuring ideas in context. So in terms of the points of infrastructure we already knew about, he did confirm that Jargon Manager was an improvement over the one-time search engines. Here's the follow-up to the opening example. Once again, he's going to use interdiscursively in the sentence. This time the sentence is, the hope is that the hearing individual will recognize the interpreter's utterance as interdiscursively linked with the deaf signers. However, in reality, this is not always the case. So see, once again, the spell check has flagged Aron's initial typing of interdiscursively. He saved the word previously so he can double check in Jargon Manager whether spell check is correct in the suggestion without having to leave the document. And so this alleviates Aron's access labor over the long term. It's like Jargon Manager has this longer term copy editing memory, and in his words, he's called it a labor storage device in terms of access and writing tools. The next example was a bit of a surprise when the deployment was happening. He found a new point of infrastructure that neither of us talked about earlier in co-design, which was multilingual writing. And the reason this came up is that in his anthropology fieldwork, because it's based in Vietnam, he at any point is describing English, American Sign Language, Hanoi Sign Language, or Vietnamese. And so here's an example sentence where this came up. The Hanoi Association of the Deaf is a Jiawei of a disabled association, meaning they cannot directly interface with the Vietnamese government. So in this example, Jiawei is the Vietnamese word that's being embedded in academic English. The correct spelling has diacritic symbols over and under the O. And so it's important for this to be typeset correctly because the word without the diacritic could correspond to different meanings. And so spelling in a foreign language poses a lot of additional accessibility problems for dyslexic writers, which is why Jargon Manager was preferable to using Google Translate or mapping with the Vietnamese keyboard. And so what's meaningful about this example is that when we see this collision of factors, right, like Aron being interdisciplinary, working in international context, as well as being neurodiverse, right? And so he reappropriated Jargon Manager in ways that neither of us predicted to continue infrastructuring, right? He took that disabled practitioner's design agency to continue with the process. All right, now let's go up a level to transferable theory, which is the infrastructuring for access framework. So infrastructuring is a cyclic process that occurs over time. That means we can treat breakdowns and workarounds as important design clues, right, when we're doing ethnography, qualitative methods, understanding the local context. And then with disabled practitioners, we can interpret their access needs as part of that local use context, right, looking at what's happening with the global and the local in scenarios. So let's follow up on some of the earlier considerations we had around design lenses and different design approaches. We offer a sensitization question. What are the workarounds that disabled communities perform repeatedly that are not broadly recognized? And in this power dynamic, the disabled people are the practitioners, and the technologists ought to follow their lead. And so then when we're prototyping, the workarounds inspire the redesign or the extension of global technology affordances, right? Which means that, back in the metaphor, it's our responsibility to pave those desire paths into more accessible pathways, right? The broader impact here that we're going for is to increase disabled communities' agency and reduce daily access labor burdens, so we can keep our colleagues like Aron in the field and support diverse disabled participation for longevity. All right, thank you so much to supporters and local communities. Here are the takeaways. We're excited to discuss infrastructure for access with you and different use cases.
So we have time for a couple of questions. I see Sev lining up.
Wow, thank you so much for this incredible talk. I find this fascinating, and I definitely see myself using these tools. I use a lot of Chinese words in my everyday writing, and a lot of times I'll find that there isn't a direct translation or recognition, and oftentimes autocorrect will correct my own writing in Chinese. So I feel like I'm constantly battling these writing tools, specifically with autocorrect changing deaf to dead, oftentimes. So it's a battle I have, and again, I definitely see myself leveraging this. With that, I have a question. Aron is your only participant or user in this case. Do you think about publishing this tool to more general use so that individuals like myself can use it as well? Oh, forgot to introduce myself. I am Sev Huffman from Gallaudet University. Thank you.
Waiting for interpreter to get into position. All right, good. Thank you so much, Sev. Love the question, love the comment. Yes, absolutely. So we went with a case study because the initial ask for this method was quite a big one, right? Like, hey, use this toolkit in your dissertation over several months. And we initially was only going to do it for 2 months, and then we had to extend it to 8 months so we can get more of that infrastructuring process documented and analyzed. Because it's within Google Docs and Chrome, this is definitely something that can be deployed at scale, and so we need to get the case study out before we could do that broader study. But it's true, right? You can imagine, I love how you resonated with the multilingual writing use case, and this is definitely something that's been underexplored in the neurodiversity literature as of yet. So, yes, future work.
Great, thanks. The next speaker can come set up, and I have another question. So during your presentation, you mentioned putting the researcher hat on, and then you mentioned putting the engineer hat on. So I want you to put your professor hat now and teach us a little bit more about how the process of co-design went, because I think that's a method that all of us want to use, people working on reading and writing accessibility. So how was the experience in general, or yeah, could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a structured reflection. Both Aron and I co-wrote this in the methods of the paper. Some things to highlight would be we had a lot of rapport going in. It helps that Aron is also academically trained, so we could talk about methods, we could talk about the prototype together very concretely. He's also a linguistic anthropologist, so he's great at describing moment-to-moment user experience interaction, right? So from the get-go, we talked about how we were both bringing different ideas and different skills to this design partnership, and that is what made it feel a lot more like co-authors and colleagues rather than designer and participant. Something also to keep in mind is if you are close colleagues with your design collaborator, there are also it can be really rewarding, but also a little complicated, right? And so when he was saying that hey, Emily, I haven't used the toolkit, this is why, he could be really honest without that rather than feeling guilty that he hadn't used the prototype yet. So then we were actually able to use that into another co-design opportunity to help extend the interface even more, right? So it's having someone who's really open to exploring the technology, iterating with you, is cautiously optimistic, right? Since he also does disability studies, we can talk about ableism and accessibility and access labor and think about how technology can have a potential but also not be outright techno-solutionist. Right, so I think aligning on those values and those skills is what was really helpful to our co-design.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
So next up, we have Sabina Sieghart and Bessemans, and they will be presenting a paper on a participative study with easy-to-read users. So let's give them a round of applause, and we'll start.
Hi, I'm Sabina, and that's Aron, my supervisor.
Our research group investigates how typography and type design can enhance reading. And Sabina's focus is on the underrepresented group of easy-to-read users and how cognitive accessible design digital design patterns can support them.
So easy-to-read users are people with cognitive impairments. They face low retention, difficulty linking new information to prior knowledge, and they have trouble suppressing irrelevant meanings.
Our 5 research questions cover the context of use, how to adopt participatory design approaches and integrate UX design knowledge, which design patterns can help easy-to-read users find and select events and dates, and what socio-technical issues beyond usability arise in order processes.
We tested a novel co-design approach, integrating a UX specialist to create ecologically valid test material. All our participants have a diagnosed cognitive impairment.
Regarding research question number 1 on the context of use, ETR users, they rely on Android, Samsung smartphones more than the control group, probably because of cost reasons. Assistive technology is underused, likely because of barriers to installation and stigma. So there is a key takeaway here, which is to optimize standard apps and built-in features and consider carer support.
To avoid dysfunctional test material, we developed an enhanced participatory design process. You see me here with one of our co-researchers, and he shows me his suggestion on his mobile. Participatory design acknowledges that co-researchers are specialists of their situation. By adding the expertise of a UX designer, we profit from a professional usability analysis of existing order processes. The UX designer provided best-case examples, which the co-designers used in combination with their own examples to create paper prototypes. The test screens were created by the UX specialist according to industry standards and evaluated by the co-researchers. These are the paper prototypes. The UX designer translated them into digital screens within the corporate design of a real theater, which was chosen by the co-researchers as our use case. And this is our test setup. Here is the first task, find the play Antigone. You see the researcher or the test participant clicking, and you see the written tasks on the table.
For experiment 1, we compared 3 card variants. So the first one, in the A condition, it's the text below the image, and the variant number B, the text on image, both requiring scrolling, and then a larger swipeable card with text on the image in variant C. What you also can notice on the right of the slide is the design patterns that we tested, which are the components, specific kind of elements, interaction patterns, and tokens.
86% of the participants successfully completed the task in A and B, and 70% in C. Both swipe and scroll was used, sometimes hesitant, sometimes fluent. The control group had no issues and appreciated the clean design. Research question 4 and experiment 2 raised the cognitive load. Participants had to find a play at a specific date. Again, 3 variants were tested. So we have the version without the image, the version with a small image, and the card on a swipeable position again, which also allows scrolling.
Variant C with option to swipe or scroll performed the best, with 79% being able to perform both tasks. Dates with numerals found easily. The card with images were more successful. Text on image is preferred. Experiment 2 was more cognitively demanding process, including 2 steps: finding the date and finding and reading the name of the play.
Our data showed dissonant results, particularly for one play named Läuft, in both the test and the control group. Many clicked on the card to double-check the name of the play on the detail page. This is the blue in the graphs. Läuft is a colloquial German word and meaning what is going on. Participants from both the test and the control group said, it only says running, I'm a bit confused now. It only says läuft, I'm confused now. Hence, there are linguistic issues with the name of the play Läuft to its ambiguous name. And we took the text from the theater, so we didn't change anything. That's what the theater had as the play name. These issues could be overcome best in variant C, where image and text are in close proximity. In research question 5 and experiment 3, we covered a full order process. So people had to go through the 2 previous experiments and then through the order process. And we reduced the order process to 4 screens with a concise, prominent headline. You see here in German, select date, Datum wählen, select seat, Sitzplatz wählen, your order, Ihre Bestellung, which is a summary, and pay. You had to scroll to confirm seat and enter contact details with autofill. As you see, each icon reinforced each step. So our buttons for the ticket have a ticket icon, for the seat they have person icon, for the summary they have even the money bills, which was one of the wishes that you saw before in the paper prototypes of the co-designers. And we have these little arrows in the blue back and forth and confirm buttons on the bottom. And these icons provide a second pass to the understanding to these people who have difficulties reading and sometimes very hard problems to read.
So the results, they were mixed. All participants recognized and clicked the ticket button, a strong accessible design pattern. The second run was generally faster. However, many simply clicked the dominant blue button without reading it. Qualitatively, participants often expressed a preference for a real-life option rather than digital-only payment.
Using grounded theory, we identified 7 user types. From the fearful type, who was held back by restrictions by parents and had bad experiences and was seeking reassurance from the test leader, to the adventurous type, who just clicked ahead, was not fully grasping the consequences. These types highlight the heterogeneity of the group and point forward to future work on individually usability and protection needs. So there is again the lazy type, the childlike type, the reluctant type, or the independent type, and the cash type. So we had these 7 types that we figured out in the qualitative analysis.
This study shows that enhanced participatory design process with a UX expert is highly effective and it's also low cost. It should become a standard practice. We also provide empirically validated cognitive accessible design patterns that designers can apply to other use cases.
Further research is needed to integrate these findings into generative AI applications, carefully to avoid harm to this vulnerable group, and to develop personalized payment profiles. Until a safe digital payment option exists, a real-life agent, a real person at a counter, remains essential for this group's autonomy. Thank you. On the codes, you will find both the test materials on top, so you can do the test yourself, and the full article on the bottom.
Thank you. Questions from people in the room? Humphrey.
Hi there, Humphrey Curtis from King's College London. I think this is really cool work. We're developing similar tools, web interfaces, where we're trying to make them accessible for a community that has challenges with reading. Generally speaking, we've used a lot of progressive disclosure, as well as we've hired a disabled artist to try and check the UIs that we're building to make sure that they're accessible before we deploy them. Out of all of your design patterns, do you have any one in particular that you think was really effective for communities that may struggle with reading and too much cognitive overload within these UIs?
Yeah, well, you see that like 100%, like everybody was able to click the ticket button. So this was clear. Nobody ever, was even hesitant. So like, they just clicked it. And again, also for the blue buttons, which are continue and back, immediately. Also the autofill, the green button, they just clicked it. So they knew what it was. And in the slide, we also have, familiarity of these buttons. So you see here that autofill wasn't even familiar to many of them, but they clicked it anyway. So, I mean, that's also the risk that if it's too easy, they will, have payments that they're not, like, nobody is legally allowed to do a business in our group. So if it's too easy for them, they just, have involuntary purchases, which also they said often it happened to them before. And this is why we figured out these types, because some, despite, having bad experience, they still, were very keen to order online.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker can come set up, and while they're setting up, I have one other question. So you have several years of experience in the design industry as well. So I was curious, like, how do you think this process, your enhanced design process, would become adapted in industry, and what would be the challenges? Or, yeah.
Yeah, well, the thing is that, I worked with a professional UX designer, and I mean, I've been in the industry 25 years, so I know them all, and I kind of had the role of moderating it, because they are used to work with personas, but it's very interesting for them to work with co-researchers, because they have totally different, very blunt, sometimes, I can't do this, I want it differently, and they are very, they really have ideas. They showed me, I can order here, so I want it to look like this, I want the money notes on it, and the designer was like, money notes, are you sure? And yes, we are sure. So for them, it's really helpful to actually work with the co-designers. And my feeling is industry is kind of afraid to work with co-researchers for lack of, familiarity. And I mean, it's very easy to work with them, so just work with them. That's our suggestion. Just ask them.
Great, thank you. Sounds like something that would be a good Kai panel in the future, like how to make industry adoptable.
Well, I think we also one of our reasons was that a lot of test material, what we see in research, is really poor and doesn't meet industry standards. And this is why we wanted to have a good method that we also propose for future research. It's out there now, use it please, because I mean the people are there, and combine experts, and it's low cost. It takes more time, obviously. You have to consider this, but it's really low cost.
And I think also more from a holistic approach is that as designers, if we look at designers, like if they have like this kind of interest into research, it opens new creative horizons. If they work interdisciplinary, if they start being confronted with co-researchers and give them new, inspirational tools to how to design differently.
Great. Thank you. Let's give them another round of applause.
I'm sorry, we didn't answer the question, but we can talk about it, I guess.
Oh, yeah, sorry. There was another question.
We are there.
Yeah, sorry, we'll have to cut. Yeah. Thank you. So our next speaker is Satwik, and he'll be presenting a study on assessing effectiveness of AI in accessibility forums for blind user support needs. Yeah. So let's give our reader another round of applause.
Hello everyone, thank you for being here. I'm Satwik Ram, a PhD scholar from Stony Brook University. In this talk, I'll be presenting our research work, Finding the Signal in the Noise. Basically, it's an exploratory study on assessing the effectiveness of AI and accessibility forums for blind users' support needs. Let me begin with why getting support for non-visual computer use remains challenging. Non-visual interaction remains challenging not because blind users lack expertise, but because the interaction itself is often inconsistent and cognitively demanding. Screen reader shortcuts and interaction patterns vary across applications. Customization can be fragile in practice, and even routine tasks can require substantial command memorization and navigation effort. And this list goes on because each user encounters a unique set of accessibility challenges depending on their screen reader, software versions, scripts, and personal configuration. So they frequently turn to online resources for support. A plethora of mainstream online resources such as official documentation, blogs, video tutorials, question and answering platforms like Quora offer guidance for troubleshooting and skill development. However, prior research has found that these resources are highly visual, extensively relying on annotated screenshots, spatial layout descriptions, as well as mouse-oriented point-and-click instructions that seldom translate into operationalizable steps. To navigate these gaps, blind users have long turned to accessibility-focused online forums, such as JAWS for Windows and NVDA groups, which provide screen reader-centric guidance rooted in lived experience. These forums often surface practical, hard-won knowledge, including advanced shortcuts, configuration advice, and workflow strategies that are rarely captured in mainstream resources. More recently, GenAI tools have added a new layer to this help-seeking ecosystem. Unlike traditional resources that require users to search across multiple sites, GenAI tools can consolidate information into a single conversational interface and often reinterpret into more sequential and keyboard-oriented guidance. So while accessibility forums provide screen reader-centric advice rooted in lived experience, GenAI tools offer fast, on-demand conversational support. Together, these tools form an indispensable support system for blind users navigating accessibility-related challenges. Earlier work on accessibility forums has shown that these forums function as trusted support infrastructures for blind users' day-to-day problem solving. Many users prefer them over asking sighted peers because these forums provide concrete screen reader specific guidance for navigating inaccessible software and troubleshooting breakdowns. Prior work has also looked inside these forums by analyzing mailing list threads such as Logic Pro Players and Programming L. This line of research shows that shows how blind users formulate help-seeking queries and how community members structure their responses to deliver practical guidance. Some scholars have also examined the structure of the forum discussions, showing that their language can be relatively screen reader friendly, while others have proposed browser extensions that automatically disentangles overlapping topics to make navigation through screen readers, navigating long discussion forum thread more manageable. So taken together, prior work has mainly focused on content analysis and interface interventions, but we still know much less about blind users' practical lived experiences of using forums, particularly how they navigate fragmented threads, track scattered details, and turn forum responses into operationalizable steps for solving their own computer interaction-related problems. Prior work on GenAI accessibility presents these tools as both enabling and problematic. So they can offer fast, convenient support and improve information access, but they also introduce familiar risks around hallucinations, verbosity, and the verification burden placed on blind users. While prior work has identified both the benefits and the limitations of GenAI for accessibility, we still know much less about how blind users actually use these tools to address computer interaction related needs in practice. To fill this knowledge gap, we conducted a semi-structured interview study with 14 blind participants. We asked how blind users use accessibility forums and GenAI tools for computer interaction help, where they struggle with each and what needs and preferences should guide better support design, focusing on regular screen reader users with prior experience using both resources and excluding participants for whom that comparison would be less meaningful. We audio recorded and transcribed the interviews with participants' consent, manually corrected transcription errors, and de-identified the data using pseudonyms. In total, our data set comprised 462 transcript pages and 2 pages of field notes, which we analyzed using a hybrid reflexive thematic analysis that combined deductive quotes from prior literature with inductive quotes that emerged directly from the data. Next, I will walk through the key themes and the sub-themes that emerged from our qualitative analysis. In accessibility forums, participants often tried to search within the forum thread using the platform's native search functionality, expecting to locate relevant mentions of keyword within the discussions. But in practice, the search often returned site-wide matches instead of thread-specific results, flooding users with completely irrelevant threads. So rather than supporting efficient in-thread retrieval, these built-in search functionalities were often experienced as broken and unreliable. Another common difficulty involved quoted text inside forum replies. So in many cases, there was no clear separation between the new responses and the quoted material from earlier prose. So screen readers would often read the whole thing as one continuous block of text. So, and because users often had no reliable way to hide, collapse, or skip the quoted content, it became difficult to tell what was new, what was repeated, and what actual response, like where the actual response began. As a result, quoted text added confusion, repetition, and extra cognitive effort when trying to follow the discussion. When built-in search functionality failed, participants often relied on a browser control F function to search by keyword. But that too was burdensome because the results were scattered across thread, including the quoted text. So users had to navigate them linearly and manually piece together what was actually relevant for them. Another challenge was the amount of metadata that screen reader announced before users could even get into the actual content. So for a single post, the screen reader might read the thread title, navigation controls, author information, heading structure, date, post, links, etc., all through ARIA roles and accessibility properties provided by the web page. And this pattern repeated for every post in the thread, including controls like quoted text toggles and other interface elements. So the issue was not a lack of accessibility metadata, but the cognitive burden of having to listen through so much of it before reaching the information and that actually mattered. Another key challenge was multiple topics within a single thread that often obscured the caveats that determined whether a particular solution was actually usable. What looked like a clear answer earlier, what looked like a clear answer early on could be qualified, contradicted, or narrowed much later in the discussion. As a result, participants had to manually piece the thread together to determine what really applied to their situation. Participants also described how troubleshooting became exhausting when relevant information was fragmented across a thread. A single post might raise multiple questions while the replies only address them partially and in different places, forcing users to keep track of what had and had not been answered. As a result, blind users had to mentally stitch the thread together to form a complete solution. Some participants attempted to manage this through external note-taking, but constantly switching between the thread, other tabs, and their notes introduced additional cognitive overhead. Rather than simplifying the task, it made it difficult to track partial answers, integrate fragmented details, and sustain troubleshooting progress. So far, I have focused on participants' experience with accessibility forums. Next, I will turn to their experience with GenAI tools. Participants also described GenAI responses as vague and underspecified in ways that made them hard to operationalize. As shown in the slide figure, the responses suggest changing a setting in NVDA, but it does not explain how to open the relevant settings interface of or which specific menu path to follow. So even when the answer sounded plausible, participants still had to infer missing steps before they could act on it. Consequently, participants often had to reprompt GenAI to get from a plausible answer to an actual usable one. That made prompting itself an accessibility burden because users had to repeatedly ask for missing specifics like exact menu path, control name, shortcuts, etc. before they could act on the response. Participants also encountered hallucinated responses that sounded confident but were simply wrong. In practice, that meant that system could fabricate interface elements, settings, or action sequence that did not actually exist, making verification a necessary part of using the response rather than an optional extra. A related problem was fabricated references, which made misleading answers sound trustworthy. Instead of reducing effort, these false citations pushed users into extra verification work. Another challenge was that GenAI sometimes contradicted the prompt itself by responding with broad explanations instead of step-by-step guidance users had asked for. These verbose responses increased cognitive load and forced participants to extract the actionable parts on their own. Participants also described context leakage across chats, where GenAI blended the current task with unrelated prior context, because participants often use different screen readers across devices, for example, VoiceOver on iPhone and JAWS on a computer. These mixed responses could sound plausible while still not fitting their actual setup, forcing extra testing and verification. Finally, participants were also clear about what better support should look like. For forums, they wanted a cleaner auditory access, stronger structure through headings, isolated topics, clear question and answering formatting and markers that help signal verified or high-value responses. For GenAI tools, they wanted honest and reliable output, step-by-step instructions, and responses that could be tailored to their individual setup through customization of reusable profiles. In conclusion, we examined how blind users rely on both accessibility forums and GenAI tools for troubleshooting and learning assistive technologies. We found that forums are indispensable but often overwhelming, while GenAI is fast and convenient but frequently introduce vagueness, accessibility mismatches, and verification burden. These findings highlight the need for a support system that provide concise step-by-step guidance, surfacing caveats clearly, and delivering trustworthy screen reader optimized help. This concludes my presentation, and I thank you for your patience and time.
So we only have time for one question. Anyone has a quick question? Then, Zhengrao, you can maybe come set up. I'll ask a quick question. Sure. So you sort of looked at forums and AI separately, but I think with advances in AI, for example, retrieval augmented generation and similar other things, how do you foresee them being combined potentially? So all the good things in forums could be combined with AI.
We actually asked this question to blind people in our interview study. So blind people said that they wanted some kind of browser extension that can leverage the power of GenAI tools to extract the conversation and do some kind of topic segmentation or restructure the entire discussion forum thread into topic segment units so that it's convenient for them to follow the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's give the speaker one more round of applause, and then we'll... Thank you. So next up, we have Jingguo, and she'll be presenting a paper on just-in-time adaptive intervention for enhancing mobile readability for people with in situational visual impairment contexts.
Hi everyone, I'm Jingruo. I'm a first-year PhD student at Cornell Information Science Department, and this is also my first Chi. So today I'll be presenting SIGCHI Front, a just-in-time adaptive intervention interface for enhancing mobile readability in situational visual impairments. So as many of us might have experienced before, mobile computing presents unique challenges due to dynamic usage context. We read while we are walking, running, so this would lead to situational visual impairments. This would usually arise from light changes, motion, and environmental noise and distraction, and this would also constrain our reading rate and cognition. So most of the existing solutions rely on manual adjustments or simple rule-based automatic adjustments. However, a lot of the systems examine individual factors in isolation, and sometimes they would also assume the context to be stable. However, real-world SVIs would involve multiple dynamic contextual factors, so light change, motion change, or the personal state change can all happen within the same reading session. So that's why we want to have something that's dynamic and personalized, and that's the system that we try to achieve. So to ground our design, we first did a semi-structured interview study with 15 participants. We structured the interviews into 3 parts. We first asked them what are the typical reading impairment scenarios they've experienced, and then we asked them what are the current coping strategies and motivations they are using, and also we tried to elicit ideas for ideal solutions. So from the interviews, we find that we can categorize SVI factors into 3 categories. First, environmental factors such as vibration, reading distance constraints, as well as light changes. And for personal factors, there are visual ability, fatigue, and distraction. And lastly, they also have problems with text parameters such as presentation due to font size, weight, line spacing, and letter spacing. So participants do have strong need for personalization because they think their preferences might vary between might be different with other people. So to further examine how environmental factors would actually impact the font parameters, we did a controlled experiment with another 18 university students. So the design was a 2x3 within subject design. We have 2 light intensity level, low and high, and then we have 3 motion states, standing, walking, and running. So we asked the participants to read 6 Chinese passages. We asked them to adjust the typography until comfortably reading. So the idea is not to to pursue speed or accuracy, just to see how they would actually adjust the font parameters. So a quick sanity check, that the experimental conditions actually differ. Yes, we find that there are significant differences between lighting conditions and motion conditions. And then we see how the environmental conditions affect preferred font parameters. We find that the effects are quite structured. Light mainly changed font weight, and motion mainly affected font size. However, line spacing only had moderate change, while character spacing saw no significant effect. So what happened when multiple SVI factors co-occurred? They do affect the font parameters more significantly. For example, we have the strongest adjustment in outdoor running condition, and also we find that individual differences remain large. Even in the same condition, the participants do not converge to a universal setting. So based on the formative studies, we designed our system. It has 3 modules: label tree, ML pipeline, and human AI loop. The reason we have 3 modules is because we want the system to achieve 3 things. We wanted to be able to model the context in a structured way. We wanted to be able to suggest font parameters, and we also wanted to achieve personalization over time. So the label tree is how we decided to define the reading context. We defined the label tree to 3 layers. First is the movement, second is the location, and the 3rd layer is the self-report state. We consider the first 2 layers to be something that the system can try to infer from our sensor data, although it's not very accurate because we don't have any camera data, but those labels would go through user confirmation and revision, and also they will be stored with the sensor data so that the system can be more accurate over time. And for the self-report state, we think it's hard to infer, so we ask for user input. So to activate the font parameters adjustment, the users would long press the screen, and the font parameters would adjust automatically. And after the font parameters are adjusted, they will see these 3 interactions. They first need to see the detected context and to confirm or adjust them. And then they would select whether there are any personal influential factors such as fatigue, distraction, or declining vision. And lastly, they can further adjust the font parameters if they think the current ones are not good enough. So this is the system architecture. Due to time constraint, we're not going to go into details about it, but please go to our papers to read more descriptions. So to finally evaluate our systems compared to like manual adjustment baseline, we did this user study. We structured the user study into 3 phases. We first have a pretest with traditional manual interface just to understand our participants' baseline reading performance. And then we have a 4-day adaptation period using our system. We ask the participants to use it as many as possible. So although we only have 4 days, they can try to be somewhat personalized to their preferences. And lastly, we have the post-adaptation comparison between SIGCHI and the baseline. So we had 2 tasks for our participants. First, they're asked to read aloud the passage while they're reading them, and we audio recorded for further analysis. And then after reading the passage, we asked them to answer the multiple choice questions. So for measurements, we first measure the reading output. So it is basically the number of correctly read characters per minute. So we want to measure both the accuracy and the speed. And in addition, we also measured reading and comprehension accuracy, workload with NASA TLX, user satisfaction, and post-study interviews. So we had 12 participants. They're all native Mandarin Chinese speakers. We focused on these 4 primary SVI factors. The first one is intense brightness. We simulate this by asking our participants to read passages during noontime in summer outdoor. And then for high vibration, we asked them to walk on a treadmill. And for distraction, we also gave them an obstacle navigation task while they are reading the passage. And for fatigue, we asked them to carry a backpack with some kind of weight. So as you can see, this is a very tiring user study, and we really appreciate all the participants for their effort. So for the findings, we find that across conditions, SIGCHI did improve reading output. Significant improvements are shown in 6 out of 8 scenarios, but we didn't see any significant differences in reading comprehension. We think it's because the passage is high school level and they're too easy for native speakers. But interestingly, if you compare baseline pretest and baseline post-test for reading output, you can actually see a learning effect. So we will talk about it later. And for the workload, we find that our system did reduce mental demand, physical demand, and effort in some conditions. And lastly, we also find that users do prefer our systems, but they also think our system needs initial learning efforts. So based on the qualitative findings, we find that users like the system for its convenience, but they also identified a lot of issues. For example, context detection are sometimes wrong, long press were sometimes imprecise. They did not want to activate the font parameters at all, but they just press it without noticing it. Manual sliders were hard to use while moving. Sudden changes could interrupt reading rhythm. And CoStar remains a problem during early use. Although we have data from study 2 and they serve as our initial priors, but users find that during the first few days, the system is not very accurate. And also, we think binary feedback is too coarse. Maybe there would be more richer feedback if we give them other tags. And for 2 key considerations we got from the qualitative findings. First is activation must be precise and predictable to avoid turning adaptation into interruption. And second, it should try to preserve the layout stability so users do not lose their place during reading. And for limitations and future directions, this study is focused on Chinese text. As we know, like reading Chinese text and reading English text can be very different from multiple angles. So future work could explore other languages. And reading materials were very easy for native speakers. We only explored 8 common SVI conditions without exploring all the combinations. We didn't compare with simpler rule-based baselines, and there are also other design choices such as privacy, battery latency, or monetary cost that can be considered. So thank you. If you're interested in our paper, please check out the QR code. And if you're interested in my work in general, also please feel free to reach out to a coffee chat. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. There was 10 minutes on the dot. So perfect. I see Gareth lining up. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. It's Gareth Tickwell from RIT. It's really nice to see a situational impairment paper at CHI. One of the things about situational impairments, and you kind of covered this early on, is environment, device, person. Do you have plans with future work for different devices? So I'm thinking like smartwatches or screens that are maybe smaller, or even a big thing right now is augmented reality and glasses and things. So yeah, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that would be definitely interesting. We didn't actually think about devices like smartwatches, but for me personally, rather than using mobile phones, I actually use like Apple Watches to check like my fitness or like to see any messages during more intense sports. So I think that would be definitely an interesting angle to extend this work. Thank you. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks. The next speaker can come set up. I would love to talk to you more about simulating the compose. There's another. Lisa, sorry, I keep missing on you. Go ahead.
All right, no worries. Lovely talk. This is Hernie Secretary in University of Maryland, College Park. I love this extensive study, and so maybe this sounds like a little bit of an unfair question, but everyone experienced situational impairment, and there's this lovely paper from Leah Finlater on wheelchair users experiencing situational impairments, and I was wondering, you had activities like walking, running. You could imagine translating some of those activities into, wheelchair users, being in a rush or in different situations. Maybe this is like kind of you trying to guess, but what would you say, which part of like your findings would be challenging to generalize to that user group, for example?
So are we trying to say like what part of the findings would be useful for like population like wheelchair users?
Yeah, like how much of your findings could be generalizable to people experiencing another disability, irrelevant of the, let's say
Yes.
not the vision context, but like they're wheelchair users or like they're using another aid, mobility aid. Just some thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question. I think a lot of the factors that are underexplored in this study is about like cognitive side. So I've also worked with ADHD population or like people with cognitive impairments, and I find like distraction might be like a bigger factor in terms of reading performance for them. And for wheelchair users, unfortunately, I didn't have too much experience with them, but I personally would also think maybe like navigation tasks, like those kind of environmental factors, like physical factors, could potentially be more influential in their personal context. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks. So our last speaker, let's give her another round of applause. So our last speaker is Swami Anantanarayan, and he will be presenting a paper on verification practices of blind users when working with generative AI in spreadsheets.
Okay. Hi, I'm Swami. I'm a faculty member from Monash University. That's in Melbourne, Australia. Minoli, I'm presenting this on behalf of Minoli, Chetai, and Kim, also from Monash. Minoli was actually supposed to be here today, but it's a bit of a thing to get from Australia to here at the moment. And so her flight was canceled very last minute. But anyway, so to continue, I'm going to be talking a little bit about how blind screen reader users, their verification practices when they're using Gen AI with spreadsheets. This background must be familiar to a lot of you. Blind users use screen readers primarily to access spreadsheets. It's a bit of a disaster. And so what ends up happening in the best case is if the screen reader, if a table is properly tagged with accessibility features, then a cell like C2 might be read as 8.77, et cetera, 2013, Angola. And you do this for kind of every cell. It's a very slow, it's a very tedious process, and it takes forever. The background is that there's a lot of people who've looked at this. We're not the first. They've explored this kind of linear interaction paradigm, and they've found that screen readers users find it difficult, obviously, to identify trends in data, find content, applying formatting, any graphical information and charts. So all this is incredibly cognitively demanding, and they need to put in a lot of extra time and effort to complete these tasks. So fast forward to today, we obviously have a plethora of Gen AI tools out there, Copilot, Gemini, ChatGPT, to name a few. They're all kind of somewhat able to perform these tasks, but there are hallucinations, and that's very prominent that we all know about. That makes verification incredibly essential. So the issue is that verification is kind of implicit for sighted users. We just kind of do these micro verifications visually every so often, and just to see if things are going appropriately. For blind users, everything is explicit, but there's really not been much work in this area to see what verification practices there are, particularly when you're working with numeric data and spreadsheets. So we did a user study. It was 12 blind spreadsheet users who are familiar with screen readers. And we wanted to kind of understand their verification strategies, how they respond to errors. So we essentially ended up with 2 accuracy critical scenarios that we developed. And this is based on real world spreadsheet usage in workplace and educational contexts. We included inflation data from the World Bank. That was the first one. And just something, student grades based on that a lecturer might see. So these are all critical tasks. You obviously don't want to get stuff like this wrong. And this is also based on prior work that people had done, like the World Bank data and stuff. We actually assigned 6 participants to each scenario. We wanted all 12 participants to do both scenarios, but in a pilot study, we barely made it through one. So we ended up actually splitting the participants across the 2 scenarios. And we had 3 tasks, and 3 tasks that were previously discovered by screen reader users to be difficult. And we asked them to use Gen AI willy-nilly when they were doing these tasks. And while doing these tasks, we asked them to describe their experiences, their confidence in the accuracy of those outputs. And generally, we examine their verification workflows, and we ask them, why did you use this particular strategy as opposed to something else? And what are the challenges and kind of suggestions that they had? So what happened? Well, Gen AI fabricated a lot of things. So they had a lot of types of errors for participants. Most of them were really related to the visual tasks, chart generation and applying formatting. So you could see there's multiple legends here. The chart content is cut off. There's missing or incorrect color coding. There's all sorts of formatting issues that really came up. But what's really kind of alarming is that almost every participant encountered an error, right? It was in the case that they didn't have any errors. So they're able to identify some errors, but what's alarming is that you can't really identify all the errors. For the visual tasks, particularly if you look at the chart generation and visual formatting, there's almost over half the errors were not identified. They didn't even know that there were incorrect data points, for example, in some of the charts, or things being cut off. So of the things that they were kind of able to identify, what did they do? They used a variety of verification methods, but they used multiple. It wasn't just one. So obviously here you can see almost all 12 participants used 2 of these verification methods, and then ultimately resorted to cited human verification at some point. None of the participants skipped verification, and they didn't rely on one approach. It was a very hybrid, mixed approach. And I just wanted to go through some of them in detail. Our paper has a lot more details, but in the manual verification, really, it's about as obvious as it sounds. They needed, for example, they needed to verify the maximum value, they came back to the data set and they sorted the relevant column, and then they just sort of looked at the maximum value. So just to verify it manually. This is particularly interesting when you generate formulas using GenAI. Most participants, you download the GenAI produced sheet, and then you inspect the formula using the screen reader, which is kind of a tedious process in itself. It's actually the most trusted. Obviously, there's a sense of agency, and you can really kind of do it yourself. But in some cases, the manual verification, it just doesn't really work well. It's really cognitively demanding, but especially if you're analyzing trends and things like this, it's like, oh, geez, you got to go through each cell and then kind of see what's happening. But if you have charts or visual appearance, they had to rely on a lot of alternative verification methods. That's where we have this kind of same AI verification, and that's what we kind of called it. But basically, it's a bit like, they were a detective and they have a suspect in the seat. The suspect is the Gen AI, and they flood it with questions. It's like to see if you're internally consistent in the answers that you're giving. So basically, like, yeah, tell me why you did what you did. Give me the step-by-step calculations that you had. They started a new chat session, for example, within the same AI, uploaded the previous results, and then sort of queried it, have it query its own results from the previous response. You basically grill the AI to see if it maintains some sort of internal consistency. And that sometimes worked. It sometimes spotted those errors in 1 or 2 cases, but sometimes it didn't. And when that sort of did not work, they went to a different AI. So now we're getting multiple. So obviously, if you're using ChatGPT, you'd go to, Picture Smart AI, JAWS Picture Smart AI, or Be My AI. And it's an independent form of verification. And so what they ended up doing was they used the common AI tools that they're familiar with, and they asked follow-up questions within that model to see if the tasks by the previous AI had been completed successfully. And you do more grilling, right? But the issue is that sometimes the newer AI also created inaccuracies, so it further complicated the workflows. So you end up not really knowing. So here's just an example. This is one of our participants, P10. We were just asked, the participant asked ChatGPT to highlight kind of the failed students in red and confirmed if the task, asked them to confirm if the task was done. Of course, ChatGPT responded, yes, it's done, but it didn't do anything. There was no highlighting that was actually present. The participant then used their screen reader to find inconsistencies. Then they checked it with Be My AI. And initially, Be My AI said there was no highlighting, which is the correct answer. But after kind of further probing, it reported that some of the cells are actually highlighted. So this led to even more confusion and multiple rounds of verification across tools, and in the end, seeking human assistance. It's something they just couldn't do. The full workflow is detailed in our paper, and there's lots of other workflows as well. So I really encourage you to look at that. It's actually quite nice to see all the flowchart diagrams. This is just one example. So what does this all mean, right? So what did we end up with? What we can say from all this is that we have some design considerations for verification strategies for screen reader users. So one is feedback on visual tasks. It's kind of a no-brainer. Most of the errors are occurring in charts and formatting, and these are the hardest to verify. Really, they need to support detecting visual errors. And even if you can't do it within the same AI, maybe allow different AIs to import the context very easily so that the verification can be done kind of seamlessly. The second one, which I think is really quite promising, is really in the line of reasoning, and it's debugging, essentially. Obviously, participants rely on a lot of steps, so make those steps as transparent as possible. Make the reasonings transparent. And so if you're saying you're going to highlight things in red, say, okay, I'm going to this cell, I'm going to highlight it in red, this is the outcome of what happened, so that it helps the screen reader user kind of go through that process and identify, oh, did this actually do it? Or where did it actually fail? And I think that's actually quite interesting from a debugging perspective, and that could build trust in the system. And the last is one of education. It's really about prompting and sort of helping users adapt prompts to verify the outputs, sort of having the Gen AI scaffold these follow-up questions automatically and provide prompt suggestions, such as, would you like to know how I did this? Or would you like me to show you this cell and have the screen reader go to that cell, and then they can verify it manually, perhaps. So I just want to kind of conclude, sort of to say that the verification workflows are not simply kind of slower versions of sighted users' processes. They're actually a little bit more fundamentally more complex, and they require a lot of explicit effort. The marking feature is that the explicit nature of the verification process and the need for very clear interaction and instructions. Obviously, none of the participants wanted to give up on Gen AI. Not a single participant said, oh, we're not going to use it. It's a great starting point. They're very cautiously optimistic about it, but it gives them a great sense of agency, even though they might not necessarily trust it at this point. So we really need to carefully design for this particular target user group. That's all I have. I'd love to take questions.
Thanks, Somi, for the talk. So we're at time, so maybe one question. Going to double check on her, Nessa. Yeah. Oh yeah, yes, go for it. Great, thanks.
This was a lovely talk. Thank you so much. SIGCHI, University of Maryland, College Park. This is a curiosity question. You found that they missed half of the errors, and surprisingly, any studies we've done with blind participants and them identifying errors, either is in computer vision, like object recognition, or is like detecting errors on ASR, like automatic speech recognition, where they dictate and they hear it back. We also find 50%. They miss half of the errors. What's going on here? Do you have any guesses at like how we are consistently finding across different tasks for the same population and across different, machine learning techniques and domains, consistently, and these technologies have been improving a consistent rate of about 50%, where it's like 49 for us, but so I was curious if you have any theories.
Yeah, so I think part of the issue is that even when the errors are coming, the whole context is not really presented. In the case of Gen AI, especially when chart generation and things are happening, those are where we're hitting the 50% errors, right? With images. So a lot of times in the Gen AI case, the image generation is not really as good, simply put. The other thing is that it's not, when you're using it with other AIs and things like this, they're often taking screenshots with their phones, and there's things that are occluded, right? So there's like, for example, in ChatGPT, sometimes that prompt overtakes the actual view screen. And so when you're doing this kind of work, it's not just the hallucinations, it's also actually the accessibility issues associated with this. So they're actually using multiple tools. And when they're using multiple tools, things are not necessarily, they can't tell that the screenshot that they took is necessarily occluding this view and stuff like that. So when they input it to something else, obviously that's not going to be like a great picture, which is why I think it's really important for this kind of communication, this context communication between different AIs or different devices in general. And perhaps that will help. in that process. But I actually think it's more helping help the users have more self-agency in this process of debugging, and just saying, hey, look, this is what the image actually looks like, even if so that they can kind of identify the errors to some extent, themselves.
Great, thank you. So yeah, let's thank all the speakers and student volunteers and the audience for a lot of questions. I think we had 6 presentations, so we were able to sneak in a lot of discussion, which is great. Cool, so have a good rest of your lunch and then rest of your kai, everyone.